In this presentation, we will look at two broad principles, each of which had a large influence over the formation of myths, such as the ones we will be considering in this course. First, we will consider a few of the effects living in an oral culture might have upon myth formation. Second, we will discuss the role of logic within primitive societies and how this was instrumental in the formation of myth. Let us begin with oral culture. Written languages have not always been with us, which means every ancient culture began as an oral culture, that is, a culture with no written language. Imagine never being able to write down anything. Everything that you deem valuable about yourself and your society is established only within the memories of yourself and others. In oral societies, certain individuals were designated as rememberers. These people were responsible for remembering the history and social rules of the society. These rememberers were the first poets, for placing information into rhythmic speech patterns made the information easier to remember. We might mention here that Homer, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the most famous of the Greek oral poets, was reputed to be blind. There was probably no one person named Homer. Rather, it was probably a designation used for a number of poets. Why blind? Because a blind person in an ancient society had to find a way to contribute to the society, and one of the few ways this could be done was to become a rememberer. Thus, poets were generally blind. I guess if you were blind and had a bad memory, you'd be out of luck. Oral societies would have festivals throughout the year in which all the people within the society would gather and listen to the poets recite stories concerning the history of the people. These festivals thus functioned as a means of ensuring a bond between individuals, for within these stories were embedded the religious, moral, and social practices of the day. Of the many relevant oral effects, I want to consider only three: the principle of importance, the distillation principle, and the Leith effect. The principle of importance says that myth is not trivial. I have mentioned this before in relation to the great goddess. Mythology is not simply a collection of interesting stories. Oral cultures have a fundamental limiting factor. There's only so much that can be remembered within a culture. Think of the information within a culture that must be remembered in terms of computer storage. A person who remembers data would be like a hard drive. As one person's memory fills, you would need to add another. Plus, you would also have to have redundant systems in case someone died, backups. Furthermore, there's only so much data that can be repeated during the festivals. All this says that there must be an upper limit on the amount of data stored within the society, and that amount isn't huge. This means selection must take place. If you're at your cultural capacity for knowledge storage, and a new piece of data comes along that you deem essential, some other piece of data has to go. And when it goes, it's gone forever. There are no lasting archives or libraries in an oral society. When data is forgotten, for whatever reason, it is gone. What follows from all this is that the data that is remembered won't be trivial. The myths that we will be studying were passed down orally for millennia until finally written down. If they were deemed important enough to be remembered by these ancient societies, they must have held important truths. And it's these truths, often buried in various ways, that we are interested in discovering. So, according to the principle of importance, it is only the most important events and stories that are remembered in an oral culture. But it's very difficult at times to know exactly what to include as background information, and this is where the Leith effect comes into play. The Leith was a river in Hades which caused forgetfulness. So if you ever want to say you forgot something, you can say you were dipped in the river Leith. Let's consider a few examples. First, let's consider a phenomenon called circumpolar dropout. In Arctic regions, each animal was said to have a spirit that watched out for it. This became problematic since before a tribe would go hunt, say, a bear, they would pray to their gods to help them find and kill the bear. But the bear's spirit would also hear this prayer and would go and warn the bears, who would then be more careful. So in order to avoid this, the tribes stopped mentioning the word bear, using instead a description of the animal in other words, such as the brown one, which is Bruin in German, or the honey gatherer, which is Medvar in Russian. In the regions where this was practiced, the name for the animal itself was eventually forgotten entirely, and all that was left was the description. To this day, we do not know the original terms used for various animals in the northern regions of Europe and Asia. Here's another example, the Tetragrammaton. In ancient times, gods were sometimes lured away from their original cultures by other cultures. The Romans were famous for this practice. They would see a god or goddess in a conquered territory and like some of its aspects, so they would take it back to Rome with them. Literally, they would take the statue of the god. This was important because the deities usually had specific places where they interacted with humans, and if you took the statue home with you, that's where that deity would then show up. Which is why it was so important to the Trojans to replace the Palladium stolen by Odysseus and Diomedes, which led to their destruction, for they tried to replace it with the wooden horse. Some cultures took to chaining their statues in place so they couldn't easily be taken. But in more ancient times, instead of physically hauling away a god or goddess, societies would resort to magic. Using the god's name, they would try to entice the god over to their society, where they would be much more reverent and give better gifts to the god. To avoid having your god stolen, you had to resort to secrecy. The name of the god should not be spoken, for if your enemies didn't know how to pronounce it, they couldn't use their magic to steal it. Thus the Hebrews removed the vowels from their sky god's name, rendering it unpronounceable, leaving only the 4 letters known as the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. This is translated as Yahweh or Jehovah, but no one knows for sure what the name is because it was a secret so well hidden that the name was lost entirely. This is the point of the Leith effect. Knowledge that is hidden in the past will eventually be lost to the present. Another example of the Leith effect has to do with Loki. In Norse mythology, there is the story of Loki, who was punished by the other gods for killing Balder. His punishment was to be chained underground in a cave and to have acid dripped onto his forehead. Loki's wife, though, tried to alleviate the pain by holding a cup over his forehead that caught the acid. But eventually the cup fills and she has to run out and empty it, at which time the acid drips onto Loki and makes him shudder. This was an etiological myth at the time for a geological phenomenon, and was so well known that no one thought to explain it. But Loki's shuddering refers to an earthquake. Snorri Sturluson, who relates this story in the 12th century, says, "You Christians call this an earthquake." I wonder how many myths have such explanations at heart that were so commonplace to those who heard them routinely that it was never spoken, and now we are clueless.